Our topic today is LNG, new players and trends. This is Professor Cleveland Jones, international consultant to the oil industry, researcher, and advisor for geopolitics in the energy industry.
Nice to be with you again, Cavani. It's always fun.
Always a always a pleasure to have you here. Let me only show some definitions that's very important for my understanding. What is LNG, liquefied natural gas? Is a natural gas with a extreme reduction of volume, 600 times reduction of volume, and so that's in this case is easiest to transport from a place to another place. And this is the value chain of natural gas. It's important before you have your slides, Professor Cleveland, from the exploration, production, dry or associated gas, uh, refrigeration, and liquefaction, turning liquid this gas, transporting via vessels, ships, for example, from the United States to Europe, is a long distance carrier, and storage and regasification, turning back to the natural gas properties and going to the consumers. So I brought this slide because it's very important to understand what's the flow of
Yeah,
LNG.
Cavani, it's good that you showed that. I think oftentimes people don't grasp how significant LNG has been for the world. Until LNG came into play, natural gas was a regional thing. And prices were completely different in different regions because you just couldn't ship natural gas very far. Maybe pipelines would be as far as you can do it, but within the same continent, maybe nearby. After LNG, natural gas became a world commodity. Obviously, with higher costs involved in liquefaction and regas and so on, this value chain obviously has capex and opex costs involved. And but the changes that have come about are so startling that could be a story in itself. And in fact, the world is still benefiting from that, even though there's a lot of changes going on. And maybe I can talk a little bit about that. Maybe I can show some of my slides here, if you don't mind.
Sure,
I
sure.
uh,
Let me remove
I
this one. Yeah.
I just wanted to bring out the scale of LNG trade volume. 600 billion cubic meters per year. That's 1.6 billion per day. It's just incredible. This is what has happened in the last 20 or less years, and it's growing. It shows no sign of diminishing. And I think this is important because when we say, oh, the bumps and so on, yes, maybe there's a slowdowns and so on, but this is a long-term trend, and it would be very unusual to expect, major flattening or reversal even. It's going to be very difficult.
When
But
you say when you say sorry, interrupt you. When you say 1.6 billion cubic meters per day, Brazil is 100 million.
50.
Oh,
This is what Brazil uses. So, I mean, just look at the scale. It's 30 times more than Brazil uses as a whole
okay.
country. And
Mhm.
that's being shipped back and forth. So the scale is enormous. And it's growing. So even though Brazil, of course, is growing, but natural gas and especially LNG is where the action can be. Because you just could not, just like 20 years ago, you could not expect natural gas to become a world commodity if you can't ship it anywhere. And it's just
Perfect.
impossible to do it effectively otherwise. But
Excellent.
there's another way to look at it. The LNG itself, the supply and demand, you look what is under construction right now that is going to come in 25 and 2026, 27. There's already, these are long-term plans because obviously liquefaction plants and so on, other than maybe floating LNG, which is maybe quicker, but you still have a relatively long lead time. All of these plans are there, and it would be unlikely that, this is not happening. Partly because there will be other projects that will increase this, and maybe some projects don't get built. But the reality is that this scale looks optimistic, but personally, I believe it
Uh,
is realistic.
Professor, could energy transition to solar and wind, for instance, reduce this trend, or exactly the opposite because the intermittence of
Yeah,
solar?
I think you're right. It's more likely to be the opposite. Solar and wind and new energies and renewables are not likely to dampen this. There is year to year changes in some countries. Large projects, could substantially reduce natural gas demand in a certain country for energy generation. But overall, in the world, it's the opposite. Natural gas is still a good backup. It's, a base energy. It's flexible. It's not intermittent, or it can be flexible and not intermittent. So this is a very strong trend. And in fact, it might even be pessimistic. We say this looks like an optimistic view, but it could accelerate because there are many countries right now in Africa and Southeast Asia and even China and so on that could actually increase natural gas consumption when and if they reverse a little bit their coal consumption. And
Yeah.
that is so big that any change in coal usage could be very big for natural gas. Um,
It's interesting because it's more than linear. The growth is
yeah, it seems like it's accelerating, and it may for at least 5 or 10 years. It could do that because gas supply is not the problem. I show this in this slide. Uh, well, this is price. So obviously, price is very important because when it's very expensive, you have less incentive to use LNG and so on. But right now, prices seem to have stabilized at a much lower level, including levels that were prior to 2022, for example. So this high volatile price range was an anomaly. LNG is likely to stay around that range that we're seeing now. They even compare it to the Platts dated Brent, but the prices are low, and it's low because natural gas is still uncoupled from oil. And even though production in many cases is proportional, you have a lot of dry gas production, so it's uncoupled, and natural gas is extremely cheap. Um, and in terms of supply, for example, just look at the US. A lot of different kinds of gas being produced, even coal bed methane, gas associated with oil, tight gas from formations that are still called unconventional. But shale gas is the big story, ever since
and is
2015.
referred only to United States. This
Yeah, this is
chart.
in the
Okay.
United States. But I show this because the United States is a mature natural gas play that has found its way to potentially increasing supplies at least for 10 years. Not just 3, 5 years, maybe for 10 years, it can increase supplies. And basically, the increase will come from shale gas, as we've shown here. Most of the other sources are not increasing. But with this situation, you have the United States as a major uh, impulse for LNG growth and supply of LNG in the
Sure.
world.
Sure.
And
That's interesting because the gas associated with oil is only 6%, and
exactly, this is what.
is that so what Brazil allows to explore here? So it's forbidden to have shale gas in Brazil, isn't it?
Well, it's not forbidden. There are state mandates that forbid it, and in
Okay.
all cases, shale gas and basically produced with fracking, which is the big deal here in Brazil, has no real place in Brazil because it's not a large potential shale gas play in the world. Uh, my co-researchers, Professor Rene Rodriguez and Hernani Chavez, and I have produced a lot of studies showing the potential for unconventional gas, and it is big. But as long as you have less troublesome offshore gas from the pre-salt, and you have international supply of LNG and natural gas all over, it's not going to be a shale gas play. And that is true in many other countries. And this dominance of the U.S. is a like a glass ceiling for many countries to develop
Yeah.
their own shale plays because it's very difficult. Take Argentina, for example.
For example,
Everybody talks
Vaca
about
Muerta.
Vaca Muerta, and it has tremendous shale potential. But we have Georgie. Hi,
Jorge,
Georgie.
good evening from Portugal.
Good
Welcome.
evening. But you see, Argentina has large potential, but the learning curve has been atrocious, very expensive to get to the levels of the United States in terms of logistics, supplies, the value chain,
Costs.
availability of all of these things that are necessary for shale gas to take off. And now we're talking puny amounts. Even if it multiplies 10 times over, we're still talking relatively insignificant to what the US is. And the US is growing very fast. So it's a very a big elephant in the room, an expression I like to use. You can't ignore it.
Mhm.
Uh, and then if you look at the actual LNG exports, yes, they're volatile to some extent. But you see, there's a lot of new projects coming in, including projects where the investors are not U.S. companies, including Middle Eastern companies, the very countries who are OPEC champions are recognizing that LNG to be able to penetrate into world markets, this is the game, the United States. And they are investing in large LNG projects because that is where LNG is cheapest to implement. Large projects can be set up, everything is nearby. So it's very difficult to overcome those advantages. And again, just this year's LNG exports, just the LNG exports are over 8 times what Brazil consumes in natural gas. So you start looking at comparisons like that, and you say, the LNG is way beyond the numbers that we even imagined. Even 10 years ago, we knew LNG was going to take off. We didn't imagine it was going to be so big.
Mhm.
Um, and this shows a little, I want to show this, which is not a repeat, but look, these are the projects coming in. And when we say the United States is the big player, yes, you look at these green lines, and that's supposedly Mexico. Here, Energia Costa Azul, Vast LNG. The Mexico LNG projects are with U.S. gas. The gas is produced in Texas and shipped to Mexico, and Mexico plants turn it into LNG and export it. So this adds up basically to U.S. supplied LNG. And this is a realization that many people don't have. If Mexico takes off, and it's likely to replicate more of those LNG plants because it's very close and has those advantages, Mexico can become a player and share in some of that growth. Obviously, they're not producing the gas, but they have a play in the supply and will make money from it. And they can become good players because if they take more and more gas from the U.S., which is still plentiful, they can be players and increase this supply even more. And you see the great amount of different projects going in,
Uh-huh.
even in the next couple of years. Um, but of course, this is not just a U.S. game. If you look, and Qatar and Australia used to be the biggest LNG players, and U.S. overtook them, and the U.S. is growing fast. Qatar is trying to catch up. It has big expansion plans. This yellow is an
Mhm.
expansion plan for Qatar. It's trying to stay there. It's just like a race, Now they're in second place and they're running as hard as they can. It's going to be very difficult for them to catch up. The United States has uh, maybe smaller plans, but multiple plans. And this is the
Mhm.
advantage of the United States, a very good base from which to build infrastructure. So even if you don't build, five trains with 30 million tons, you can build many trains here, there, and everywhere. And you
Mhm.
look at Russia, this yellow in Russia is, of course, iffy because I think that the sanctions can be most effective in LNG, in Russian LNG plants. So these expansion plans will likely be pushed back, if not for 5 years, at least for 2, 3 years or more.
This is a good point. Please let me interrupt you because Nord Stream 2, when was exploded by someone that we
Yeah.
do not know who, the volume expected was 400 million cubic meters per day or 500. So comparing to the 1.6 billion that you show in the first slide, so
Yeah.
it's a very big amount. It's not proportional to this Russia in
Right.
this chart.
We're talking LNG, and Russia had the advantage until recently of having large exports by gas pipelines, which the United States, for example, does not, because the United States ships some to Canada, Canada ships some to the US, the United States ships some to Mexico, but that's about it. It isn't exporting natural gas by pipeline.
Yeah.
Russia was doing that almost exclusively and not much by LNG. Now that the situation has changed, all of that gas that was being exported by pipeline mostly will have to be converted to LNG until the pipeline projects, which are very long term to China and whatever, you know, come into being. And those are also likely to be delayed by sanctions because, pipelines require compression stations, which require Western technology, which is where the United States and the Western world is turning the screws. So Russia is unfortunately for Russia in a bind in terms of being able to maintain its exports of natural gas because LNG will be delayed. Natural gas exports by pipeline uh, in the other direction, going east instead of going west, has to be built. And even now, China is reconsidering,
Yeah.
what it's going to do, and so that is going
I,
to be
I suppose to Portugal and Spain, Algeria is the source of natural gas.
exactly. And Portugal and Spain are big entry points for LNG into Europe. Um, the coming years will show that eastern part, uh, Italy, Greece, considering Cyprus and Israel with large gas potential, liquefaction going into Europe, that will change. And geopolitics has taken a turn that 10 years ago we didn't imagine. When the large gas deposits off Israel and Cyprus and so on in Egypt began to be discovered, we knew that that was going to be a big game changer. But it takes 10 years, to build infrastructure, to have the confidence that they can build all of that with the resilience in terms of war prone zones. Well, it's offshore, far away from conflict, but it's still tricky. So it's going to be changing, and Egypt doesn't show any large increases, but there are plans there. So I think maybe at least doubling or more from Egypt, Israel, and possibly Cyprus. So that can also come into play. But you see that the number of countries involved guarantee that LNG is more even than OPEC. It's a more distributed supply.
Yeah.
So
And power.
it's that helps the consumers because the consumers feel more confident that they can
Uh,
rely on that on
does
LNG.
OPEC take care of NG,
LNG.
LNG? No, only oil.
Right. We've seen a lot of talk. Even we discussed a little bit. The prospects for for natural gas OPEC or LNG OPEC. Yeah, it's being discussed and it's possible, but that is mostly not a scary topic because that is mostly to reallocate supplies. I don't think we have any concerns that a natural gas OPEC or an LNG OPEC would come in to restrict supplies and raise prices. Partly because LNG prices are already much higher, of course, than natural gas prices
Yeah.
in the US. So you're basically at a level which is, it hurts a lot of countries, and that is why many less developed countries are still only importing LNG when absolutely necessary because it is considerably more expensive.
Hmm.
At these low gas prices in the US and technologies for shipping being more efficient and so on, we may see a little slight lowering of prices or remaining at those levels that we showed
Yeah.
a couple slides back. Um, but in terms of liquefaction capacity, one thing is exports. How much LNG you're exporting? The U.S. has greatly more liquefaction capacity than it's actually using, and is planning to build more. So this is again showing how the U.S. is going to be a major player, and because it's the U.S. and not maybe Russia or Nigeria or something like that, the market is less scary of this dominance by the U.S. because a lot of it can go to Western Europe among among its partners and so on. But if you go down the list, of course there are countries, including part of OPEC, that you can say, well, they could try to disrupt markets
Yeah.
if they wanted to, but they are minnows in the ocean. They're not
Hmm.
sharks. They're not whales.
Hmm.
But it's important to see that it's a very long list of countries, including some that are small. For example, Mexico, as we mentioned, can increase a lot. Many Middle Eastern countries already have export capacity increase plans. So this down below here in the lower the right side can actually increase also, and that can help the overall LNG market in a very balanced way to be supplied from more different places,
Yeah.
including regionally.
Hmm.
Very important. And then, of course, we show that LNG is a global commodity. It's going all over the place, from Middle East to the Far East, from the U.S. to Europe, also to the Far East, and even from Canada and Australia, of course. So it has broken into the commodity as a global commodity. And that has only happened in the last 10 years or so. But it's very important because it's gaining strength because as more natural gas is recognized as an essential part of the energy transition, which many people want to ignore because it's still fossil fuel, but it's a much cleaner fossil fuel. When that recognition comes in, including by Europe, and they start getting their feet on the ground and say, yes, we will need a lot more natural gas so we can get rid of coal. And even before we get some of the nuclear power plants that we need, then natural gas will increase and LNG is the way to go.
In this case, Brazil is an importer of
It
LNG.
is actually not very well shown here. You're right, but it's a sporadic importer, and it's likely to even decrease its imports in part because, as you know, it's developing a new gas pipeline from the pre-salt fields onto the major refining areas in Rio de Janeiro, which will take up some 18 or 20 million cubic meters a day. That will lighten up some of the LNG demand. But again, Brazil was never a big LNG
Yeah.
demand center, so effects are minor. But that shows some of the fluid movements that can happen in the world. Many countries, including in Europe, for example, can develop alternative gas supplies, even from North Africa. That might reduce the need for LNG. On the other hand, you have a lot of Southeast Asian countries who may become new LNG importers. So overall, that not only tends to balance out, but actually increase LNG demand. So, in specific points, yes, some countries might reduce LNG imports if they can develop more gas supplies themselves.
Okay.
But the trade routes are there. It is a global commodity. This is a recognition that people have to
Yeah.
understand, because many people still have the old view, LNG, it's
Yeah.
expensive. It may be expensive, and that's why natural gas reaches Japan at 5, 6, 8 times what a natural gas costs in Houston. But they still import it. They might still need it, and so do
Yeah.
countries.
Yeah.
Um, and this also shows some of the widely, uh, I wouldn't say balanced, but because it differs by continents, but production and consumption of natural gas is much more evenly distributed than oil consumption and production. And that was the reason why OPEC was so powerful, and it scared a lot of countries and so on. Much less likely that the natural gas OPEC or LNG OPEC could function in that way because of this distribution. This is important to also keep in mind. It will be a glass ceiling for any interventionist opportunities.
Uh-huh.
And then I wanted to point out some pros and cons or market forces that can base our final conclusions, because there are things going on that favor market tightening. For example, if more coal to natural gas conversion happens, and I foresee that in the next few years, maybe not next year or two, but within 5 years, people start recognizing that natural gas can have a lot of advantages over coal, even if it's slightly more expensive in some cases, because of pollution effects, because of environmental concerns, and so on. And even European demand growth might happen faster than we anticipate, because a lot of other energies may not be there as fast as they might anticipate. India is always a big question nowadays, maybe more than China, because China is big enough that we can more or less chart its path. India has been more difficult to chart its path, but now we are sure that India will be a very big growth market for natural gas. It doesn't have great chances of supplying much of that, so it will be a large importer, probably
Yeah.
LNG from many sources. The fact that nuclear power plants are going to be very
Yeah.
slow to be implemented. So until you have a significant number of new nuclear plants, natural gas is the base power to supply the grid.
Fast track.
Yeah. LNG shipping demand. LNG carriers are being built at a rapid pace. If we get some stickiness there, if you can't ship
Yeah.
LNG, maybe the LNG prices might go up a little bit. We'll discuss that, but that's a possibility. But the building schedule, might get some delays. The big countries are China, South Korea, and Southeast Asia, and so on. But of course, LNG projects are more expensive outside of the United States. So this could put a slower growth into LNG, because if Indonesia or other countries want to emulate the U.S. growth, it's going to be more difficult, much more expensive, getting investment and so on. So that growth in other countries might be a little bit more
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, greater penetration in small
Small
markets.
market.
In small markets overall, there's 190 plus countries in the world. It's not just China and Western Europe. So when you look at that, many of these small countries are going through the same energy problems that some of the large countries are going through. And if they decide that a small floating LNG plant can be a supply of energy for them, all of a sudden,
Yeah.
Hundreds of countries can become a potential market, and that can,
Mm.
increase demand. And of course, the energy transition should favor natural gas. I was just at a meeting today. People were talking as if, oh, we have to get rid of natural gas. where are they? In the moon, in Mars, somewhere? No, it's the opposite. We have to increase natural gas consumption in
Yeah.
order to achieve the energy transition which the world needs.
Stability. Yeah,
Yeah,
because
of
the
course.
intermittence. Yeah.
But of course, there are surplus factors too, because the U.S. supply growth
Hmm.
is very fast, and we discussed
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
Qatar is right on its heels. Russia is trying hard. Maybe we'll be able to
Maybe or not.
source. Maybe we'll be able to source equipment from China. It's not the same, but maybe they can
Yeah.
find pumping equipment or whatever from China. If that is the case, in a couple of years, they can start putting LNG into the market. Mozambique in Africa is a interesting new play. It could be an example for other African countries, although, as we discussed before, Africa has a very big uh, difficulty to overcome in order to attract capital for projects. And Mozambique has been delayed, internal strife, all kinds of problems. And of
Mhm.
course, China, if its uh, demand slows down, because China is now at a point where it cannot grow at 6-7%, it's trying to grow at 5 something
And,
percent, and
and
maybe slower.
coal plants are supplying the demands of energy in China.
Exactly. And coal plants are still supplying and they're still building coal plants.
Yeah.
But look, when that inflection point comes, and it will come, the day that China decides to build less and less coal plants and actually retire some plants, and they have many plants that should be
Yeah.
retired. When they start doing that, all of a sudden, they will need a lot more natural gas.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
they will do that only when they can source that gas from Russia because it's more reliable for them, or from the U.S., Qatar, and so on,
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah.
They won't do that until they know that LNG can supply that shortfall. But they will be decreasing coal consumption down the line.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there's other countries that
Other
are
countries.
coming in with LNG projects, maybe
Hmm.
more expensive, but if you have the gas and you
Yeah.
have to export it, Canada, Nigeria, Guyana, which is definitely going to be there, Brazilian reduced demand, even though it's small. Other
Yeah.
countries are also growing their own natural gas supplies that might reduce pressure for LNG. So there's a balance here. Um, if it's okay, I think this puts it together so we can reach some conclusions if
Yeah.
if you're ready for that.
Yeah, sure. Let me share with you and all the audience the companies, what they
Yeah,
are they doing? Any, for instance,
yeah.
has a global LNG portfolio is the number 10.
Eni is already big in LNG, and this other than the U.S. companies, this is a model for some of the other
Yeah,
European companies and so on.
yeah, perfect. Equinor is a case of a
Yeah,
potential of a growing
yeah.
market.
And this is another company that we have to understand. Equinor is not just Europe. Equinor is big in Brazil, and its
And
plans in Brazil include producing
gas
gas from the
production. Yeah,
pre-salt.
but see that LNG to more than 20 countries around the world. So big player.
This is the trend that I was saying. Now we're getting globalized in every
Yeah,
which way. You
Conoco
know,
Phillips.
um, I would say that they're a proponent of LNG. Each company has to decide what makes sense for them. If they
Yeah,
have large gas supplies at reasonable cost that can accept the cost of LNG conversion, regas, and so on, they'll do it. It depends where they are. But now Conoco is big in Texas and so on, so they
mhm,
have the gas supplies that can provide
yeah,
LNG going forward.
yeah. Gazprom.
Yeah, the Russians would love to get into LNG. The problem there is the bottleneck in technology because of sanctions. And
Yeah,
for
that's
them, it's a big bottleneck. It's not
yeah.
money, it's bottleneck.
Yeah, and
BP,
they have huge
yeah,
reserves.
they
So
have
that's
huge
fine.
reserves. Um, Yeah, BP, I think maybe him and hawed a little bit a while back. I think it's found its path again, but it has around the world, including Africa and so on, potential for producing LNG, producing natural gas to LNG for export, and then nowadays a lot of the LNG projects will come in as spot projects. They don't
Yeah,
know where they will go,
yeah,
but when
per-
they have it, then they'll put it in the market.
yeah, perfect.
Total,
Total
total.
Energies. Yeah, this is
Yeah,
a strong player, no doubts.
yeah. Again, the European companies have recognized because they're importers of LNG that LNG is a big deal, and they can source gas from producing countries other than Europe and
Yeah,
get into the LNG.
yeah. CNPC.
China, important. I think one of the things that we didn't realize that is that China is very active in sourcing its energy outside of China, and this means investing in oil and gas plays outside of China, investing in LNG outside of China, and
Diversifying
CNPC and
production.
other Chinese companies are doing that because they recognize that that is how they can ensure their energy
Yeah,
needs going forward.
the demand is growing. Yeah, of
Yeah,
course, our friend Shell.
yeah. Shell is big and it will continue. It's who is going to grow faster. That is, I haven't done company by company reviews, although we know big projects they have after and
Yeah,
so on. But this is a game where it's so fragmented, and as you're showing, we have so many companies involved that we
mhm,
don't have to have a champion. We have to
yeah.
have a widely distributed.
Widespread one. Yeah,
Chevron,
Chevron,
of course,
strong American company,
18.
of
Yeah,
course.
okay,
And finally, the first one
yeah.
is ExxonMobil.
And it's we can't. I think Exxon has been the most transparent about its focus on increasing presence in the shale patch, increasing shale production. What are they going to do with it? They have to export it, and LNG is the way to go.
Perfect. So
Uh,
the
let,
conclusion is that, sorry,
well, uh, in the short term, there is, of course, a relative balance where reasonable prices, price volatility can come from, geopolitical surprises, maybe more wars and so on can affect things in the short term. But we are in a relative balance. Medium term, the
mhm,
next 5 years or so, there's possibly a price weakness because there is a very large growth in LNG projects coming on
projects.
stream. So
Yeah,
maybe many of those are spot. Maybe they'll
yeah,
have to, lower prices to get them out. But longer term, demand might catch up again, and I am a strong believer in that, and that will continue to drive even more LNG growth, especially if natural
yeah.
gas becomes a key energy
Short,
transition.
short questions and short answers, please. Long-term contracts or short-term trading?
A mix. Many projects are from the start. They say we will contract 50% of production and we'll go spot the other 50, and we'll decide whether it's
Yeah,
Japan, South
perfect,
Korea,
perfect.
whatever. And that is a risk distribution, a risk allocation decision.
Next question, intermediaries or owners and consumers directly?
A little bit more difficult because now that we see a lot of Middle Eastern investment in LNG, both in the Middle East and in the U.S. specifically. I'm not aware of many other countries, but
Uh-huh,
in
uh-huh,
those,
okay.
the big players. If that is the case, now the big oil and gas players, which are
Yeah,
Middle Eastern companies, they will be large LNG players, and they will do their marketing and
yeah,
sales efforts more or less like
okay.
OPEC.
And the last and easiest question, Nord Stream 2, nevermore?
Yeah, you think it's easy. I don't think that's an easy question. I think that nowadays people recognize that LNG is so flexible and that the additional cost of LNG in relation to pipeline gas is a good price to pay for flexibility, ensuring supplies that are flexible, that are sourced from anywhere else if you need to, that it makes sense. And you have to understand, markets depend on prices, and the LNG market is a global market, so prices are very good way of allocating production and demand. You know, the flexible production to a great extent, and very flexible demand. For example, China was able to buy oil when it was cheap and store it. A lot of countries can do that with LNG and store LNG or natural gas.
So
And if
you
prices,
answered.
yeah,
You
if
answered
prices come
indirectly.
down,
You
that's
answered
flexibility.
nevermore. Bye bye,
Okay,
Nord
never
Stream
mind.
2.
All right,
Thank you so much, Professor Cleveland Jones. It was a
take
pleasure.
care. Good.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.